So let's briefly take a look at the requirements of the exam AZ-203, Developing Solutions for Microsoft Azure. Now, this exam is a developer-focused exam. People who take this exam are Azure developers who design and build cloud solutions. So this is a developer-focused exam, and you should expect that the questions are going to come to you from a developer's perspective. Not all of the questions are coding questions or asking you about code, but there are going to be some coding questions on this test. If we go down and we can see the scheduled this exam section on this page, we can see that this exam is available in English, Japanese, Simplified Chinese, and Korean for now. So you get your choice of language. It currently costs $165 US. It'll be localized to your country. So if you choose your country, you can see that the price changes. You can actually schedule to take the exam from home. This scheduled exam button will actually let you book it either at a testing center or as a proctored exam from home. Now, there is some difficulty for proctored exams because they require you to have a webcam, you have to have a computer capable of running the software, a room, a door that closes, a completely blank desk, etc. But you do have the possibility of taking this exam at home. Let's see what skills this exam measures. We'll go into the skills measured section. There are 6 big topics on this exam. The first one is called Infrastructure as a Service, and we'll learn about what that means. Platform as a Service, which is another paradigm for architecture of applications. Azure Storage, security, of course, monitoring, troubleshooting, and optimizing solutions, and finally, consuming Azure and third-party services. So what is Infrastructure as a Service? Infrastructure as a Service basically covers any type of technology that you would typically run in your own data center or on premises. This includes servers, and in the case of cloud, these are called virtual machines. This also includes networks, but this test does not have any networking components. It's also talking about Azure Batch Services, which is a cloud way of running jobs in a massively parallel way, and as well containers such as Kubernetes. We switch over to the Platform as a Service section. We'll see that covers web apps. Now, that's a different style of developing applications than virtual machines, but there's a lot of advantages as a developer, including one-click publication from Visual Studio. We're going to look at the difference between web apps, mobile apps, and API apps, which are pretty much the same thing, but they have different features, of course. And finally, one of the new paradigms for the cloud is functions. Functions are small pieces of code that are intended to have a very small and definite purpose, but basically a function can be developed and deployed within the cloud browser, not even having coding or Visual Studio or anything like that. This is a small piece of code that connects a couple of things. Storage, of course, one of the great benefits of using cloud computing is to be able to store files, unlimited, infinite storage. Now, of course, you're paying for that, but you're never going to have a run out of petabytes in terms of the cloud. So within an Azure Storage account, you have tables, you have Cosmos DB storage, which is a database, but you can basically use Cosmos DB to store pieces of data. Relational database is another type of storage. Of course, we all know SQL Server, but there is a version of SQL Server for cloud called Azure SQL Database. And blobs, which is files that you store in containers in the cloud. Moving on to the fourth section, which is security. Security, as we work in this cloud environment, security is one of our top concerns. We bake that in as we're designing the applications, not just after the fact. And within Azure, authentication is a big, important factor of security, which they use a thing called Azure Active Directory as their identity as a service service. Now, our access control, once you've identified who the user is, what do they have access to? The most common one within the cloud is called RBAC within Azure, role-based access control. Basically, you're going to assign users to a role, assign permissions to those roles, and then they can basically know what they can and cannot do within the cloud. Claim space is when you have a token. This is more of an API key or an access key, and you can basically say, here, I have the key, let me in, and we don't know who you are, you just have the key. And finally, data security. Big important thing within cloud these days is databases that can be secured. How do you know that your data is encrypted, and how do you encrypt it in transit? Things like that. We'll cover that in this course. Moving on to the monitoring and troubleshooting. This exam will ask you about scalability, including auto-scaling and faults, content delivery, which could be something like Redis, which is a application caching, or CDNs, which is a front-end caching solution. Finally, application insights, so that you can dashboard and monitor the performance of your application from Azure and from outside of Azure. The last section of this exam and section of this course will be talking about Azure services and third-party services. Now, this will include a logic app, which is a workflow service within Azure. Azure Search is an important service. If you do have search needs, you can use this software as a service solution for search. Creating an API management gateway. This way you can put basically a throttle authentication in front of your APIs, policies. All of the event solutions. We live in a world of Internet of Things, and when millions of pieces of data get flowing into the cloud, and you don't need to process them immediately real time, but you do need to capture them all. So you've got Event Grid, IoT Grid, notifications, event hubs. Finally, other than events, we have messaging as a way of applications connecting. The enterprise grade version of that is called a service bus, and they also have a storage queue within a storage account, which is lower grade, lower reliability, but cheaper, of course. So those are all the topics of this exam, and this is what is going to be contained within this course. One of the prerequisites of this course is you're going to need to get Visual Studio. It's a free download. You can just download that from the Microsoft Visual Studio website. You'll have the Azure SDK that comes along with this. And so as we're going through this course, we're going to hopefully have you fire up Visual Studio and be able to do some of these things, working with these services, storage, and web apps and things like that within Visual Studio. That's a great way to learn, is to do. So thank you so much for checking out this course on AZ203, Developing Solutions for Microsoft Azure. As I said, my name is Scott Duffy. When you do pass this course, you can go to take the Microsoft official exam. And when you pass that exam, you'll call yourself Microsoft Certified Azure Developer Associate. Little badge you can put onto your resume, onto your LinkedIn profile, anywhere you want to brag to people that you are Microsoft certified. So that's the goal at the end of this course, is for you to take the test, pass the test, and get this badge. So let's keep going. So let's talk about what you actually require in order to learn the content that's required for this exam. Now, we saw it in the last video that the skills measured section of the official landing page contains all of the items that you should expect to be tested on in this exam. So I would definitely go to the AZ203 landing page, go to your favorite search engine, enter AZ203, and you will be taken to this page, and you should be able to read through this and see that these are the required skills for the exam. From time to time, Microsoft does update these exams, and there will be a note in here that's saying that the exam will be updated shortly or has just been updated. So go check out the AZ203 landing page before you go and take the test, obviously. Now, this is a developer exam, a developer-focused exam, and you are expected to be able to develop for some of these things. These skills actually say develop Azure Infrastructure as a Service. In order to develop, I recommend that you use a development editor such as Visual Studio. Visual Studio now is a cross-platform solution, so there's a Windows version and a Mac version for it. They also have this Visual Studio Code, which a lot of people like as a smaller editor. It's fast, free, and open source code editor. Or if you want, you can go and grab the full version, Visual Studio 2019. There's a free version, community version, or maybe you have an MSDN license, or you work in an enterprise that provides you with a license and you can use a full-on version. So depending on your operating system and depending on your needs, grab a version of Visual Studio that suits you. So go in there, download that, install it, and get that set up for first use. Besides that, we do need a number of tools. There is a page, Microsoft.com, azure.microsoft.com/en-ca/tools. And this is a list of things that developers often use to connect to Azure. So we just talked about the need for Visual Studio. This code edition is a good thing to check out if that's something that you're interested in. Now, Azure has an SDK. So no matter what language that you use, whether it's C# or some other language, chances are good that there's a way to connect to Azure using that language. So if you are a PHP developer, there is a PHP SDK, and you can see Python, Ruby, Node, Java, .NET, of course, and even the mobile operating systems and even native Windows applications. Okay, so depending on what language you want to use, you should grab one version of this SDK. The reason you need this, of course, is to connect your development environment into Azure. Makes it very simple to use the APIs, to do a connection, to call the storage APIs, to upload a file, etc. Now, all of Microsoft's APIs are generally REST APIs. You don't need the SDK. You could obviously hand code all of those calls, but why would you want to do that? Now, besides Visual Studio, there are a lot of command line options. Okay, so you can be creating code in Visual Studio, but sometimes you'll need to drop into either PowerShell, or there is a thing called a command line interface that is basically a bash interface that you can go in, create some commands, run them, connect to Azure, open up a brand new blob account, open up a new container in there, do work within Azure from those command lines. Yes, this does sometimes appear on the test. So it's something that you might not want to do, but I would definitely recommend getting familiar with PowerShell and CLI. Now, as we'll find out in this course, you can get access to these things from the Azure portal. So I can run PowerShell commands, or I can run CLI commands using what's called Cloud Shell. And within the Azure portal, there's a Cloud Shell interface for both of these. So you may want to leave downloading this until later, but at some point you want to be able to connect to Azure from your command line, be it a bash shell or a PowerShell shell, then these are the ways to do that. Microsoft provides this really cool tool called Storage Explorer. If you are using storage accounts as a developer or even just studying for this test, you may want to be able to go into that storage account, examine the contents of it without having to go to the Azure portal and navigate around. Storage Explorer basically allows you, it's a little application for Windows, Mac, and Linux that allows you to connect to a storage account, and you can even connect by a key as opposed to having full-on owner access, and examine the contents of it and upload, download, delete. It's a good way to explore storage in Azure. Visual Studio we just talked about, so there's a Mac version and a Windows version. Docker, we're going to talk about containers in this course, and during the container lessons I'm going to go out to the Docker website, download Docker, install Docker, so we don't have to do this for now. There are Docker tools for Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio 2019 have the Docker tools included, but again, when we get to that section, I'm going to talk more about Docker. Now, there is also Service Fabric tools, but Service Fabric is not actually a requirement of this exam. If we go to the requirements, you're not going to see Service Fabric listed there, and so we don't necessarily need this. Next up, let's talk about code. Developer-focused exam, there's a lot of code involved. I absolutely recommend GitHub. Obviously, GitHub is a Microsoft property these days. There is a GitHub repository called Azure Samples. Azure-Samples is the account name within GitHub, github.com/Azure Samples. You can see there's over 1,200 samples right now. So they've added 200 repositories in the last 6 months. But depending on the language that you're interested in, let's say we're interested in C#, There are over 430 repositories that have C# code in them right now. And this is great when you're studying a particular part of the exam. If you're studying Azure Search and you want samples for that, it's in there. If you're studying AI, if you're studying Azure Active Directory, you can see Cosmos DB is in here, cognitive services, etc. So there's over 400 repositories containing code, and these make great things that you can download and compile, step through with the F5 debugger and figure out how they work, code that you can see, copy when you're creating your own code, and basically these are great little projects that you can figure out what they do and then implement them yourself. So developer-focused exams need code, and Azure-Samples user within GitHub is the place to start. Some years ago, I discovered this Azure Citadel site. It's an official Microsoft site. I think it's based out of the UK team. And they do have a lot of hands-on labs. So we can see here, we can obviously search and go through categories, but right off the home page, there's talking about Terraform, which is more in the administrator exam, but Kubernetes, right? So this is a hands-on lab that talks about Kubernetes, Docker, AKS, etc. We can see that basically there's some prerequisites here, and there's basically 6 modules that go through, working with Kubernetes. So the team at Azure Citadel deserves some kudos because they're creating basically long-form content, which is a step-by-step laboratory style go through in terms of Microsoft Azure. So go into azurecitadel.com. You can look at the categories and see what it is that you're interested in, whether it's, let's say, web, mobile cloud, API management lab. So there's some labs here. There's a link to GitHub again to get the labs, etc. Now, Microsoft does have their own site, microsoft.com/hands-on-labs. This has been frustrating and a little bit up and down over the past year. So I can recommend Microsoft.com hands-on labs. Go into the self-paced labs. And depending on the day and the time that you go, there used to be a couple of 100 self-paced labs. Now there's 150. Sometimes they're not working, right? You go down here and the buttons are grayed out. And so I know Microsoft, we can see that they've been struggling with these. But there still is self-paced labs. And if you're looking for, this thing is what it's going to do. It's going to launch a version of Azure Portal. You don't need an account. They'll give you a user ID. They'll give you a password. They'll give you 2 hours within that Azure Portal that you can do anything. So if you're needing some time to do practice of Microsoft Azure, you might want to launch one of these portals, give yourself 2 hours and then go in there and do some stuff. But the labs themselves have instructions to go and do stuff. Unfortunately, from the developer's perspective, there's not much. We've got 4 self-paced labs that are focused on developers. But certainly if you're interested in DevOps, if you're interested in administration, DBAs, there's probably lots of interesting stuff there. Developers, there's not much. But create a new Azure database for MySQL. I mean, that's a pretty good project, 60 minutes, and you're going to go step by step and create that within an actual Azure account with the user ID and password provided. Finally, I'm really loving Microsoft Learn. They announced this last year at Ignite, and they've continued to add new content to it. So if we go into Microsoft.com/learn, and we want to say what is your role, I can say, well, it'll show me the developer role. Well, there's now 245 micro-learning opportunities for development content. Now, some of them are short, so 20 minutes. They'll say 30 minutes, and it ends up being less than 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So they give you a lot of, quote-unquote, buffer time for this. But there's 200 of them. So if you're looking for specific things to learn, Microsoft.com/learn is a great tool. I do really love it. It's just not the same as a course like this. Now, again, there's some Kubernetes content. What you'll find when you go into the Microsoft Learn site is that some of this is just reading. So it's not video content like you're watching. we're going to go through this, and basically it's going to be a bunch of reading, continue on, maybe there's some graphics, etc. It's not the same experience that you're experiencing, but official Microsoft content and free. Microsoft.com/learn, definitely worth checking out. Well, thanks a lot for checking this out. These are the prerequisites. You're going to need Visual Studio for sure. You're going to need to go to the GitHub repositories and start finding code. And there's some other bonus resources that Microsoft provides that I definitely recommend. Now, the other essential that you need besides Visual Studio is an Azure account. Now, luckily, Microsoft does have a free account if you're just getting started. I believe it's azure.microsoft.com/free. If you go to that URL, you'll be presented with an offer that's going to give you 12 months of free services. Now, in the first month, within the first 30 days, you're going to get a credit that might be around $200 that you can actually fire up virtual machines, start up databases, and use storage space that does cost money. But within the first 30 days only, you get up to $200 credit. After the 30 days, there are 12 months worth of free services. And we can see as we scroll down here, which products are free for 12 months. We do have a Linux virtual machine. 750 hours is equivalent to 1 month. So every month you will get 1 month worth of Linux virtual machine and 1 month of Windows virtual machine. So that's 2 small virtual machines that are at your disposal per month for the first 12 months. You'll also get a certain amount of storage space, SQL databases, file storage, blob storage, Cosmos DB, and some networking bandwidth. And that should be enough for you to learn Microsoft Azure and play around with it. Certainly enough to go through this course and get certified. So you do need an Azure account. Now you might have a corporate account, or if you have an MSDN subscription, you might have some free credits through MSDN. There's about 7 or 8 different ways to get free credits. I'm not going to go through them right now, but free account is the first start. And certainly, now I have what's called a pay-as-you-go account, which means as I'm encountering costs, and you can see I encountered $50 in the past, basically within the past week or so. As I encounter costs, I basically pay for them. Now, let's talk about what's really great about cloud computing then. So we know how to get an account, but the great thing about cloud computing is all of the services that are available for you to spin up as a service. Now, you might have heard of software as a service. Azure and AWS and other places now are popularizing infrastructure as a service. That is, if you need a Windows server, you can within about 5 minutes have a Windows server up and running, or a Linux server. If you need a complete database, within minutes you can have that running, and there are literally 1,000+ options for services like this. Okay, we can talk about storage accounts and basically unlimited storage. If you ever run out of disk space in your local environment, even on your servers, Microsoft Azure has unlimited storage, and they basically charge you pennies per gigabyte. We've got platform as a service is the other option besides infrastructure, where basically Microsoft is providing some underlying code, some underlying function, and all you need to do is configure it. So a web app, you upload some code, you upload a configuration file, and Azure will run that. You don't need to have a server for that, for instance. And if you look down this list, there are just so many different categories of options, even some advanced stuff like AI, machine learning, cognitive services, Internet of Things, devices, and things like that. So the great thing about cloud computing, and certainly Microsoft Azure is one of the leaders in this space, is all of the services that you can rent. The other advantage, of course, is you're paying for it by the minute. So if you need a server, but you only need a server for a couple of hours, that might only cost you a few cents. And there's just no equivalent to that. If you're running your stuff on the premises, you can't just borrow a machine for a couple of hours unless you have machines lying around. But being able to fire up 1, 10, 100, or 1,000 machines for a short, medium, or long term without any upfront costs is one of the great advantages of cloud computing. So sign up for that account, go to portal.azure.com/free, and then you're going to basically get a free account that you can play around with, and within the first 30 days have some pretty powerful features at your disposal. And even after that, for the next 11 months, get at least one free server in Windows and one free server within Linux. And so you have a couple of options for learning beyond the 30 days.